I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. I want to talk about 5 major changes to cruising that have been confirmed and announced by the cruise lines. Not speculation, not rumor, covering things like, will there be buffets? Will you have to wear masks? What about social distancing? And what about medical certificates before you board? There are going to be some big changes which are going to enable social distancing. I've taken a look at the announcement from a whole range of cruise lines, which include cruise lines such as Virgin Voyages, Bahamas, Paradise Cruise Line, Genting, which runs Crystal, Dream Cruises, Star Cruises, Hurtigruten, the big operator in Norway. Also looking at interviews with Richard Fain from Royal Caribbean Group, Arnold Donald from Carnival Group, Frank Del Rio from Norwegian Group, looking at river cruises like Cross Europe, Avalon, Celia. And what's really clear is social distancing will happen. However, the way it will happen is by reducing capacity. Certainly at the time when cruises start rolling out, there are going to be fewer passengers on board. So if you take, for example, the Bahamas Paradise Cruise Line, they are only going to be running at 60% capacity. They're closing 2 whole passenger decks. All the river cruise companies are talking about reducing capacity. All of the major CEOs have spoken about sailing with fewer passengers on board. What I had always thought was that was not really going to be possible, but 2 things have happened that make me see how this is really going to work. First of all, I was on Holland America Zaandam just as the shutdown happened. That was not sailing full. A lot of people, of course, have been cancelling in the run-up to the shutdown with everything that was happening. So the ship wasn't sailing full. I don't know exactly how full it was, but I would say it's probably 60 or so % full. And what really happened on that cruise is it was really easy to socially distance. The theatre was never full. You could always have loads of space around you. If you went to the buffet, there was always plenty of empty tables. The dining room, you could easily get a table by yourself. The bars were never completely packed. They were busy but never packed. It was really easy when there were fewer passengers on board to actually socially distance and just manage it yourself. I always wondered whether cruise lines could actually manage that. However, one of the most interesting things that came out in some of the recent interviews is Richard Fain, who runs the Royal Caribbean Group, spoke about their big new ships. They could actually break even with around 30% occupancy, and older ships need to be at least 50% full. So it shows that the cruise lines can go back cruising with fewer passengers and still break even and make money. Definitely, you're going to see, certainly when cruises start up, fewer passengers on board to enable social distancing just to happen, to give people much more space. And of course, that is great news as a cruiser. Some of the cruise lines have also said that they will control the amount of people that go into different venues, whether that's the bars, the theatre, the dining rooms. So for example, the Bahamas Paradise Cruise Line, they've spoken about how they are going to just manage the amount of people in any venue at any time. If people aren't able to social distance themselves, there will be some controls. And the river cruising companies have also spoken about that as well. The second area, which is one that also caused a lot of discussion amongst cruisers, is buffets. There was a lot of confusion initially when on one of the Royal Caribbean calls and interviews, they spoke about there being no buffet service. That was later clarified. And it's really clear that there will be no self-service buffets, but it'll be very much like it is when ship is protecting or goes through a norovirus situation. Again, I saw it very clearly on Holland America Zaandam when they went into a completely different way of running the buffet. So for example, you couldn't serve yourself at all. Everything was served to you by a member of the crew. And they were then wearing all sorts of equipment. They had gloves, masks, aprons, all that kind of stuff. Also, what happened, again, because we had fewer people on board, it was very easy to get a table and have space between you. So the good news is if you're a buffet fan, it'll still happen. It'll get served to you. And those of you who've been on perhaps some of the more upmarket cruise lines, you'll find that's kind of standard anyway. They tend to serve you. And certainly if you've been on a ship when there's been norovirus, you'll find that is the process. It's not particularly alien and it really works just fine. One of the big hot topics is around masks. Now, as you know, with masks on land, there's lots of different advice based on which country you're in. So are you or aren't you going to have to wear masks? I'm going to talk first of all about river cruising because that's starting up pretty soon in Europe. Masks are a much bigger part of the cruise experience than we're going to see on ocean. All of the river cruising companies, whether that's Cross Europe, Avalon, Celia, they've all spoken about the role of masks in the customer and the crew experience. So all customer facing crew will be wearing masks. Passengers are going to be asked to wear masks when it's hard to socially distance, so for example, the safety briefing or other briefings, and they're going to be encouraged to wear masks around the ship and certainly on excursions. Certainly, as river cruising starts up in Europe, masks are going to play a bigger role. However, on ocean cruising, that seems to be a slightly different perspective. Partly because all the cruises aren't up and running and advice is changing so quickly. What each of the chairmen and CEOs have said of the big companies is they will have to follow and will follow whatever the social norm and requirement is at the time. By the time river cruising and ocean cruising starts, we're going to find masks are playing a much smaller role and more likely to be voluntary rather than required. However, it's all very well having fewer passengers on board, more space on board, being able to socially distance a bit more. But what about excursions? What cruise lines have said is they're going to have fewer people on tour groups and on buses. Some have gone as far, for example, again, Bahamas Paradise Line, about talking about actually only having 50% capacity on the buses. I've seen that a lot with the river cruising companies where they're talking about having fewer passengers on tour groups and on buses. Also much more focus on outdoor excursions and excursions where you can actually socially distance. So you're going to find fewer people in each tour group, so you can actually spread out much more. Another really important change is around the whole medical screening and medical requirements. Let me talk first of all about one of the things that has changed. In the run-up to the shutdown around February, March time, a regulation was introduced through Clear. All the cruise lines were saying that if you were over 70 or you fall into a vulnerable category medically wise, you had to have a signed medical certificate before you could go on a cruise. Now that has actually been dropped. So there is no requirement at the moment for people over 70 to have a signed medical certificate. However, what we are going to see is a whole lot of changes to the whole process of boarding a ship. And what we've seen all of the cruise lines that have formally announced it so far is the following. More and more of a move into no-touch experiences. So increased pressure or requirements to check in online. You'll be given a very specific time to arrive for check-in, so very narrow windows of time to try and minimize the amount of people congregating at any point in time. In the actual cruise terminal, there will be lots of sanitization, there'll be lots of use of hand gel. When you check in, the check-in staff will be behind those sort of perspex screens. Also, very importantly, there will be temperature checking going on. And if you are over a certain temperature, then you will have a separate screening and be denied boarding. There'll also be much more complex and detailed screening of where you've been, situations you've been in, countries you've traveled through before you're allowed to board. This is very similar actually to when I boarded that Dam experience where we had to fill out quite a detailed questionnaire around where we'd been. They looked at our passports to verify that we hadn't been to those countries that were identified or hadn't transited through those countries, and temperature checks were taken. A lot of compulsory use of hand gel, boarding the ship, leaving the ship, go on excursions before you can go into any restaurant. And certainly again, as I saw in the Tam, is they had people stationed outside whose job it was to make sure that you use it. So really strong compliance to that whole process. Your luggage will be sanitized before it is sent on board as well. So lots of checking, lots of pre-screening to make sure that when people board the ship, they're as healthy as they possibly can be. So that's certainly the situation at the moment. Those are the facts at the moment as regards screening. Of course, on board, there's going to be so much more cleaning protocols, with lifts being cleaned every hour, public spaces being cleaned 9 to 10 times, hospital grade disinfectant detergents and cleaning products used, just a real ramp up of the whole cleaning protocol, even sort of more than it was when ships are trying to prevent or manage outbreaks of norovirus. Those are 5 big changes to cruising that have been confirmed. They've been announced by cruise lines and they're being put in place as cruising heads up and starts again. There'll be many more, of course, to come, but those are the 5 big ones that have been announced so far. Remember, if you want to stay up to date with everything that's going on, get a perspective, insights, or just generally get cruising tips, I have loads more videos packed full of all sorts of tips and advice. So why don't you watch another one of those right now?